university, I really thought Christians were walking idiots. Well, I'd met some. And I figured Christians had two brains. One was lost and the other was out looking for it. No, I'm serious. I figured if a Christian had a brain, it'd die of loneliness. And in the university, I saw this small group of people. There weren't very many. There were 8 students, 2 professors. And they were different. They kind of stood out. You ever seen a group of people kind of stand out? Some of them do it because they're weird. But this group kind of stood out because of something I noticed, and that was this. Here seemed to be a group of 8 students and 2 professors who had a genuine, authentic love and caring for each other. Now, you'll find that everywhere, but here was the difference. They seemed to have that same love and authentic caring for people outside their group. The way I was raised, that was kind of weird. I wanted it. Oh, I wanted it, folks, as a student. So I made friends with them. And after a couple weeks, they're sitting around the table in the student union. I looked over at this young lady, and oh, she was a good-looking woman. Whew, I used to think all Christians were ugly. No, I did. I figured if you couldn't make it anywhere else in life, you became a Christian. But she was really cute, and that threw me for a loop. So I looked at him, and I said, tell me, what changed your lives? Why are you so different? The other students, the leaders on campus, or anything, why? She looked back at me with a little smile, and that can be irritating. And she said 2 words I never thought I'd hear in university as part of the solution. She looked back at me and said, Jesus Christ. I said, oh, for God's sakes, don't give me that garbage. I'm fed up with religion, the church, the Bible. Don't give me that garbage about religion. All I know is she had a lot of courage or a lot of convictions. She shot back at me and didn't even smile this time. She said, mister, we didn't tell you the religion, church, Bible, Christians, Christianity, what? We told you the person of Jesus Christ. Then I couldn't believe it. They challenged me to intellectually examine it. Now get that. To use your mind to examine Christianity, get real. Well, they so irritated me, I accepted their challenge. But I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it to refute them. It was a good motivation. I did the whole background of that great big gold book called Evidence Demands a Verdict. I wrote that against Christianity, and in the process became one of them. But so I set out, traveled all over the world, gathering the evidence to write that book. And I was in a library in a small museum in London, England. It was a Friday night, about 6:30. I leaned back in my chair, cut my hands behind my head, and right in front of everyone, which was probably 3 people, I said, it's true. It's true. It's true. I returned to the university, and I put it to the test. There were several things that intellectually persuaded me. One was the scriptures, the Bible. I concluded intellectually that it is true, and I can trust it historically and theologically.
Scientifically speaking, if you cannot trust the Bible as a historical document, then you cannot trust any ancient document, because there are more copies and fragments of the New Testament than there are for any ancient document in the world. If you look at this chart, which lists the ancient texts with the most copies in existence, you will notice that the New Testament tops the list with 5,600 copies. Coming in second, you have Homer's Iliad with 643. And third is Sophocles with 193. And you can see that it's pretty much downhill from there. In fact, most documents have about 10 or less copies. The next factor that plays a role in the science of textual criticism is the time between when the document was originally written and when the first copies we have of it are. The New Testament again ranks number 1 of all known ancient texts, with a gap of less than a generation, about 30 or 40 years. And again, Homer's Iliad comes in second, but it has a whopping 500 years between the time that it was originally written and the time that we have the first copy. You can see that with all the other ancient texts, this gap is pretty significant. In fact, there's an average of about 1,100 years between the time that these texts were written and the time that we have the first copies. The next, and probably the most important data point in textual criticism, is the question, do these copies agree with one another? That is, do they all say the same things? And you can again see on this graph that the Bible comes in number 1 at 99.5% agreement between these texts. And as a side note, the other half of 1% is simple spelling errors and other minor things that don't even affect any part of the narrative. For example, instead of saying Jesus, a variation might say Jesus Christ. To put this in perspective, let's say you have 5 handwritten letters, and they all agree with one another. That would not be too amazing. But the more copies of that letter that there are in existence, the more impressive it is that they do not differ from one another. Now, when you consider that the New Testament has 5,600 copies in existence, the most of any ancient document in the entire world, the fact that all of them agree with such precision is more than impressive. It's totally amazing. And this is also answering the objection that people often say, hasn't the Bible been rewritten so many times that we can't trust it anymore? People make this claim because they're not aware of how the Bible was translated. An author, Matt Slick from carm.org, said the following of this objection. This is a common misconception. Some people think that the Bible was written in one language, translated to another language, and then translated into yet another, and so on, until it was finally translated into English. The complaint is that since, in this scenario, it was written so many times in different languages throughout history, it must have become corrupted. The telephone analogy is often used as an illustration. It goes like this. One person tells another person a sentence, who then tells another person, who tells yet another person, and so on, until the last person hears a sentence that has little or nothing to do with the original one. The only problem with this analogy is that it doesn't fit the Bible at all. Now, you remember our chart where we had 5,600 documents that all agreed with one another to 95.5% accuracy? Well, those documents are written in the Greek language, and all of the world's translations of the New Testament, whether they are English or Spanish, French, Chinese, Swahili, whatever, are translated from the Greek to that language. So there's only one step in this game of telephone. I think that modern English speakers get confused because there are so many English versions of the Bible, like the King James Version and the New International Version, the New American Standard Bible, and so on. What the different versions in English do is try to either update the words, since the English language, like all languages, are evolving, so a word in 1611, when the King James Version was written, does not always mean the same thing as it does in 2011. There are other reasons for different English versions too. Publishers sometimes strive to give an even more accurate translation of the Greek texts. See, Greek is a very deep and complex language, and English really isn't. For example, the Greek language has 4 words that it uses for love. One for romantic love, one for brotherly love or friendship, and one for love of a family member, and then agape, which kind of is a love that you do, sort of. Where English has just one word for love. So, yeah, sometimes different Bible versions will try to make a clearer picture of what the Greek language is trying to say. But we can always track that, and we can always test them because there are concordances available and lexicons and other things where we can test what they've actually translated it as. So yes, there are different English versions, but all of them have to obey the original Greek texts, which can be easily shown, as we've already seen, not to have been victim to the telephone game idea. Now, none of these questions have been speaking about the truthfulness of the document or making claims of its validity. All that it's doing is saying that you can be sure that what you are reading is the same thing that was originally written. The next few questions have to do with that. The first is, wasn't the New Testament written hundreds of years after Christ? This is actually a really important question that plays into the trustworthiness of the message of the New Testament. To discuss this aspect, I'm going to play a clip from the famous philosopher and Christian William Lane Craig, courtesy of 100huntley.com.
I often hear students say, well, you can't know anything that happened 2,000 years ago. And what they fail to understand is that the crucial gap is not the gap between the time of the evidence and today. The crucial gap is the gap between the evidence and the events described by that evidence. If the gap between the events and the evidence for those events is short, then how long it has been since the evidence in those events to the present day is just irrelevant. Good evidence doesn't become bad evidence simply because of the lapse of time. And with regard to the New Testament, when we look at the evidence, what we discover is that these records of the life of Jesus were written down within the first generation after those events, while the eyewitnesses were still alive, with people who had firsthand contact with those who had accompanied Jesus during his lifetime. so that we actually have better sources for the life of Jesus of Nazareth than we do for most of the major figures of antiquity. For example, take Alexander the Great, the great Greek conqueror. Our earliest biographies, earliest sources for Alexander the Great, come from Arrian and Plutarch 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet, Greco-Roman historians still regard these records as fairly trustworthy accounts of the life of Alexander the Great. The fabulous legends about Alexander didn't arise until the centuries following those two authors. And contrast that to the New Testament, where we have books and records that are written within the first generation after the events while the eyewitnesses are still alive. So I think that we have very good evidence for the life of Jesus of Nazareth, very trustworthy evidence, and how long it has been since that evidence till today is simply irrelevant to the reliability and trustworthiness of that evidence.
Next, let's look at the idea that the Bible was intentionally corrupted or changed by a nefarious group like the Illuminati. This is a claim that is made all the time. Now again, going back to our 5,600 copies that are 99.5% agreement with one another, they are also from vastly different time periods and were discovered in many different countries. If anyone had attempted to change any of them, it would be the most obvious thing to everybody. All you would have to do to prove the idea that the Bible had been changed is to, say, find one copy that said one thing at an earlier time period, and then find ones from a later time period that said a different thing. It would be the easiest thing ever to do. It would be impossible for a forger to change all of those 5,600 texts without being noticed, most of which had not even been discovered yet. This is why people only make the claim that the Bible was changed, and why you never find anyone offering proof that it was changed. There are lots of scholars that study these ancient texts of the Bible, even scholars that very much dislike the Bible for personal reasons, yet you do not find that these scholars that know these things that I've been explaining today make these claims that the Bible has been changed over the years. They know far better than to claim that.
Second, the person of Jesus Christ. I concluded he is the Son of God. Oh, I didn't want to. But I concluded he was.
How can we know that Jesus existed at all? Well, we turn to history. Historians from that time period. Historians weren't even Christians who wrote about a man called Jesus. Tacitus is one of those historians.
He wrote in his work Annals around AD 115, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And Tacitus was referred to as the greatest historian of ancient Rome. Now, there were others that referred to Jesus and his followers.
Josephus, a Jewish historian, also mentioned Jesus in reference to the trial of James, the brother of Jesus. In his work Antiquity, which was only written about 60 years after Jesus died, about between AD 90 and 95, he wrote, "So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ."
So we have ancient sources, non-biblical sources, that specifically tell us that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Tacitus, Josephus, and many others tell us that he was a real historical figure. This being the case, the question is not, did Jesus of Nazareth exist, but rather, was he who he claimed to be? Was he the Christ, the Savior of the world?
Third, the resurrection. The resurrection. Oh, I thought, what a joke. Come on. People, when you're dead, you're dead. That was my worldview. I never met anyone who raised from the dead. I met some people who looked like they ought to be, but I had never met anyone who had physically been raised from the dead. I thought, you can't believe that. Well, I remember I was sitting in that dorm room on a Saturday night in university, and I just finished all this research to refute it, which is in my book, Evidence, and I finally said, he is risen. He is risen.
A lot of things have happened in resurrection studies in the last 30 years. When I went to graduate school, Middle Ages, it was 1970s. If you talked about, I'll pick a topic, if you talk about the empty tomb, there'd be a lot of snickering, and nobody but evangelicals who'd published in that area would accept it. If you talked about resurrection appearances of Jesus, Rudolf Bultmann died in 1976. He probably dominated, he and Karl Barth dominated a century of theology. Bultmann was a skeptic, and people were still in his shadow when I was in grad school. And if you mentioned appearances, everybody would have laughed, seriously. Today, the majority of New Testament scholars, theologians, historians, and philosophers who publish in the area believe in the empty tomb, almost 2/3. And where in the 70s, if you talked about bodily appearances of Jesus, they'd say, yeah, that's nice. Go back to your church and talk about it, but don't do it on the university campus. Today, bodily resurrection is the predominant view in the academy. Something has happened in 30, 40 years. What's going on? What caused the switch? Well, a lot of things, as we know, views change. But I was telling Keith coming in today that some of the latest folks who publish under the self-defined title of agnostic, skeptic, and they're friends with the skeptical community. They're often cited by skeptics. These are, quote unquote, their fellows. Here's one, a prominent New Testament scholar who calls himself a skeptic. And he says, yeah, I don't know what I do with this stuff. He said, but one thing I'm sure of, the risen Jesus appeared to his followers after his death. Is that where skepticism is? How many skeptics have moved over from here? I mean, on a grading scale from like A to F, we'll have the believers be the A's and the skeptics be the D's and F's. What's happened to move the D's to C's and C pluses and B minuses? What's going on? Raymond Brown, shortly before his death, probably the most prominent New Testament scholar in America, said that the majority of contemporary theologians in all the state universities and everywhere else, the majority of theologians are conservative today. Again, what's going on?
So we see that we can know the past, and we can find this when we get, say, multiple independent sources, unsympathetic sources, eyewitness sources, and like I said, multiple independent, and the earlier the better. And the more of these kinds of things that we have, the more confidence we can have that what we are reading is accurate. So for example, when we talk about Jesus' death by crucifixion, it's not only the gospel authors who report it. You have Paul who's reporting it, and he's reporting early oral tradition, oral history that's peppered throughout his letters that goes back to the eyewitnesses themselves. So we have early eyewitness testimony, multiple independent sources, and then you have people like Tacitus and Josephus who are unsympathetic sources who mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. So when you have this kind of stuff, even secular non-Christian sources from within a century of Jesus' death reporting his death by crucifixion, well then this is corroborative sources, and we can be fairly confident that we know that Jesus had been executed by Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of the time. So we can know a lot of the past. Again, we may not be able to know it exhaustively. Nobody can. And our reports may not be completely accurate of accounts of the past, but we can apply certain rules of evidence to come up with and corroborate a number of things about these ancient reports, be they outside the Bible or in the Bible. Now, in terms of historical method, there are some really interesting criteria that historians use to compare hypotheses, because what we basically do is we survey, we look at the sources, we determine how good certain sources are, how historically reliable or valuable they are, and then what we do is we take facts from them that we can ascertain with a very high degree of historical certainty. And some things are more certain than others as we read them. So for example, when it comes to the Gospels, we can be more certain of their report that Jesus died by crucifixion than we can that he walked on water. In other words, there's a lot better evidence to show that he died by crucifixion than we have that he walked on water. Does that mean he didn't walk on water? No. I believe that he did. All right, but I have to admit, I cannot establish that as a historian. I accept it by faith. And I think given the other stuff in the New Testament, like Jesus' resurrection, it's reasonable, it's plausible to believe he did walk on water. Or let's say even be born of a virgin. I mean, if Jesus rose from the dead, then being born of a virgin is child's play, pun intended. So, you got these things, but I can't prove the virgin birth. Some things are just more demonstrable, historically speaking, than others. So you take these things that we can prove with a very high degree of historical certainty, and we form what are called our historical bedrock. These are like facts beyond doubt. And it's this historical bedrock that we want to build a portrait of who Jesus is, or build a portrait of the past, early Christianity, when it comes to the Gospels and the New Testament literature, let's say. So we form this historical bedrock, and then from there, we formulate hypotheses. These are things, did Jesus, when it comes to the resurrection, did he rise from the dead? Or is it that he never died? Or was this a legend? Was it hallucinations that his followers were experiencing? And things like, or were they copying off of dying and rising heroes and gods from ancient religions? We'd have to consider all these kinds of hypotheses. And then what historians do is we have these criteria for comparing these hypotheses to determine which one is the best hypothesis, which one is most likely to represent a true picture of what happened. And these, a lot of them are just common sense. Imagine, let's just say, let's say we're in med school, all right? And I say, okay, we're going to learn how to diagnose symptoms today, okay? There's some general principles behind this. And so let's just say that we have here a young 15-year-old male, robust, pretty healthy and strong. And he comes to you and he complains that he's got a fever, he's vomiting, and he's got abdominal pains in the lower right. So what's going on here? And one of the students raises her hand and says, well, it sounds like maybe he's got the flu. And the professor says, no, flu, that accounts for the fever, but it doesn't account for the vomiting or the abdominal pains. And an accurate diagnosis has to account for all the symptoms. We would call that explanatory scope in history. You have to account for all the historical facts, part of the historical bedrock. Another student raises his hand and says, well, maybe this is just one of those rare cases of the flu, but it was accompanied by 2 other symptoms at this point. Rare, very unusual, but this is the one time when it happened. And the professor says, well, that's possible, but it's unlikely by your own admission, and we're looking for the best, the most likely explanation, because a lot of times in medicine, it's an art, it's an educated guess. So we would say that lacks explanatory power because you're trying to make your symptoms fit the diagnosis. Then the professor says one other thing too. We don't have any examples in the medical literature in which a person with these 3 symptoms has the flu. And so that would be implausible. We're looking for the most plausible explanation. What's in alignment with other knowledge that's firmly held? And finally, another student raises his hand and says, well, how about this? The guy's a martial artist. He's feeling sick. He's got a fever. He's got the flu, battling it. But he says, I'm just going to fight through this. So he goes to martial arts practice that night. And as he's sparring up there, he gets kicked in the abdomen. And so that explains that pain. Afterward, he goes out and eats with some of his colleagues and gets food poisoning. And so that's why he's vomiting. Now that accounts for all the facts or all the symptoms. It accounts for them without forcing them to fit too. And so the professor says, well, it does. Explanatory scope, explanatory power, fine. Plausibility, fine. Problem is, it's all based on speculation, pure speculation. We would call that ad hoc because speculation, non-evidenced assumptions. And the more you've got to speculate, the more you throw in non-evidenced assumptions, the more likelihood your hypothesis, or diagnosis in this case, has of being false. We want something with the least amount of speculation. And then the professor chimes in and says, yep, what we have here is appendicitis. These 3 symptoms fit appendicitis perfectly. All 3, you don't have to force them to fit. It's a textbook case, and so plausibility is there. And you don't have to have any speculation whatsoever. And so you would prep the patient for surgery and remove the appendix. So this is kind of what we do in history. What we would do is we'd look at all the known facts, the knowable facts. You form hypotheses, and then you're going to compare these hypotheses with how well they meet those 4 criteria for the best explanation. Just like a physician would make a diagnosis, this is how historians are going to determine what happened in the past. So, end of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The others move a little bit more quickly now, okay? Chapter 2 is, can we as historians even investigate a miracle claim? I mean, after all, When we investigate the past, such as, let's say, whether Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, that's a natural event. But when we start talking about miracles, now that would involve God, wouldn't it? And how could we ever expect, a historian can't put God in a test tube in any sense, can't verify God's existence or activity in the world. So does this disqualify, therefore, historians from investigating a miracle claim? And many historians would say yes. In fact, the majority of historians today would say, yeah, historians can't investigate miracle claims. And they'll use a lot of David Hume's arguments, which I'm sure you guys have talked a lot about here. But there are many, even some Christian biblical scholars like a James D.G. Dunn would say historians can't investigate miracle claims. Well, in my study of it, I started to look at these objections against looking at miracle claims, and I found them greatly wanting. I can't go over a lot of them, but let me just look at one or two of them. Let's take one by James D.G. Dunn and A.J.M. Wedderburn. And both of them kind of said, yeah, when you're looking at the past, kind of the one thing I discussed earlier with a challenge to history, we're really looking at what Dunn calls second-order facts, because you're looking at an interpretation of someone else's interpretation of a past event that can't be replicated. And there's no way of really corroborating it by getting into a time machine and visiting the past. So, since we're only looking at second-order facts, he says you can't verify something like that, the resurrection, because we're looking at someone's report of what the disciples said they saw of that event that we can't get back to. So we could only say that the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. We can't say that Jesus rose from the dead. And this is very, very common amongst biblical scholars these days. My challenge to Dunn and those who hold this position would be, let's take this and apply it to just any other event within the past, such as, let's say, the results at the Battle of Gettysburg, or just the Battle of Gettysburg itself. Let's suppose that James D.G. Dunn got up and read a paper at the Society of American Historians at their annual meeting, and in there he said, we've learned a lot in biblical studies over the years, and in my studies of the resurrection of Jesus, he says, I found that we can't get back to the resurrection because what we have are historians reporting what the Gospels are, the eyewitnesses reported from an event that we can't get back to. So it's an interpretation of an irretrievable or irrecoverable event. And so we couldn't say the resurrection happened. We could only say this is what the disciples believed. And so when we're talking about the Battle of Gettysburg, what do we have? We've got reports today that are based on eyewitness testimony of those who were there from an event, the Battle of Gettysburg, which is irrecoverable, irretrievable. And so it's an interpretation of a past event that we can't go back to. Therefore, we can't say that the Battle of Gettysburg actually occurred. We can only say that a number of people believed that it did. Now, if someone like James D.G. Dunn or someone else got up in front of the Society of American Historians and posited such a thing, they would be laughed out of the room and never granted their papers to speak before that group would never be accepted again. But yet they get away with this in biblical studies all the time. And I just think these arguments that they are offering are just, I think they're wrong-headed.
Well, then you go, yeah, but they got miracles in them. So do all the Greco-Roman historians. Go, you're kidding. No, they do. Virtually every Greco-Roman writer. Now, Thucydides is an exception. He says he doesn't believe in that stuff and he doesn't do it. But I mean, Herodotus, the so-called father of history. Tacitus, although he has fewer than Suetonius. Suetonius has a lot. Pretty normal. You go, well, then they're all whatever. Okay, really? They're all junk because they report miracles, right? We were talking back there before this started, and let me refer to you a 2-volume work that's just come out a year ago. It's called Miracles. It's by Craig Keener, PhD from Duke, New Testament, minor in classics. So he's a Greco-Roman scholar, and he's done a 2-volume work, 1,200 pages, part 1 and part 2, on contemporary miracle claims. He's got pre and post CAT scans, pre and post MRIs, pre and post X-rays, And some of these things, when you read them, you're going to say, how come I've never heard this? I don't know. But you can't put these things down. These two books are just incredible. He's got hundreds of cases from all over the world. He's got so many of them that the table of contents reads like this. Cases in Asia, cases in Central America, cases in South America, cases in Western Europe, cases in North America. That's how they're arranged. And then under each section, he's got little things like those with corroboration, those with heavy evidence. And his main argument in 2 volumes is this: don't call the New Testament naive because it records miracles. And don't call Greco-Roman writers, which is his second area, don't call Greco-Roman writers naive because they record miracles. Everybody in the world knows about these things except the Western university community, and they're coming around. That's his claim. So that does not make these guys naive. Because if you're going to call John naive, you call Herodotus naive. If you call Mark naive, you call Tacitus naive. And maybe they're the right ones and we're the wrong ones. Just maybe.
Someone like a Bart Ehrman would say, well, a miracle, one of the arguments he gives is he says a miracle by its very definition is the least probable explanation. Since historians must take the most probable explanation, they could never choose a miracle because that would go against what they have to do. Since it's the least probable explanation, therefore, a historian could never adjudicate positively on a miracle report. And so I would answer that, and I did in my debates with Ehrman, by saying, in my research, I found 23 different definitions for the word miracle, of which Ehrman's here is only one of them. Why should I accept his definition? After all, why must a miracle be defined as the least probable explanation? Granted, it's the least probable explanation by natural causes, but that's not even what a miracle is. If we define, let's just give it a simple definition. I mean, we could define it any number of ways, but I think most people might be satisfied with saying it's a divine event, an act of God in space-time. That would be a miracle, you could say. Why must that be the least probable explanation? What if God wants to act? Let me put it this way. What's the probability that Jesus walked on water? And someone like Ehrman would say very small. For example, there are about 7 billion people who live on the earth today. Let's say we tried to walk, we line up all 7 billion around swimming pools around the world, and we tell them, you got to try to walk on water. And over the next month or however long it would take, everybody tries and they all sink. Nobody can walk on lukewarm water in the swimming pool. Finally, let's say there's a 3-year-old who's the last one in the world to try this. And so the 3-year-old says, I can't do this. I said, sure you can. I can't. What makes you think? 7 billion people couldn't do it. What makes you think I can? No problem. Give me your hands. So he gives me his hands, and I hold him over the water. It's not too heavy. I hold him over the water, and I said, go ahead, start walking on water. And then I walk along the side of the swimming pool holding him, and he walks on water. 7 billion people unable to walk on water doesn't say anything about the probability of this little 3-year-old being able to walk on water. You say, Mike, I don't buy that. That's cheating. You were an external agent who assisted him walking on water. Exactly. And we're not talking about just a normal person who walked on water. We're talking about Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth, who claimed divinity, who claimed to be God's eschatological agent chosen to usher in God's kingdom. We're talking about Jesus of Nazareth, who said, the only way you're going to get to heaven is through me. That's it. No other way. We're talking about the Jesus of Nazareth who predicted that he would die an imminent and violent death and be resurrected shortly thereafter. That's who we're talking about. We're not talking about someone like my grandfather who died in 1978. Someone said, yeah, I just saw him the other day. I may not believe that. I wouldn't believe it. You know, there's no reason to believe that they saw my grandfather. But Jesus was quite different in his claims about himself. And even skeptical historians, atheist, agnostic, Jewish historians agree that the historical evidence is compelling enough to show that Jesus performed deeds that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. That's not to say that they were, but he was doing these jaw-dropping deeds that he thought were miracles and exorcisms. Even Josephus reports these things. Even Celsus in the 2nd century said Jesus did these things, but they were magic and trickery. All right, the Jewish Talmud calls it sorcery. You just don't call someone a magician and a sorcerer who aren't doing these kinds of jaw-dropping deeds, you know? So you got these things that are going on about Jesus. It may be very, very unlikely that Jesus was raised by natural causes. I would certainly grant that. Probably zero possibility. But if God existed and wanted to raise Jesus, then what's the probabilities of him being raised from the dead? No, 100% maybe? The problem is, as historians, we can't know ahead of time whether God would want to raise Jesus. But neither can the non-believer. They can't a priori rule out that God exists, or they can't say, well, yeah, but that's God and we can't, that's a theological problem. No, it's a historical problem with theological implications. And you don't rule out a historical conclusion that's based on strong evidence just because you can't stomach the theological implications of that historical conclusion. So I don't think miracles have to be the least probable explanation. I think that's just a wrong-headed definition of what miracles is, and we don't have to accept it. In the end, I don't think that there are any legitimate reasons for historians to pause at saying, well, this is a miracle claim, therefore I can't look at it. I think we could look at it and rule it out and say, no, this didn't occur, or it did occur, but it's not by natural causes, or it did occur, and it strongly suggests that a supernatural cause was involved. Okay? Chapter 3. Sources. So what do we do now? We've got our method down. What do we do with these, with our method? The first thing we want to do is we want to collect a pool of resources that we're going to look at and mine them. We're going to dig through these things and mine them to see what we can know about the past related to our particular subject. Now we can look, the first thing that's going to come to mind will be the Gospels. Personally, I think the Gospels are historically reliable literature. There's a lot that can be said about that. I've been studying those more and more over the last 3.5 years. Hope that one of my next books, 2 books, are going to be on those topics. I do think the Gospels are historically reliable literature, but there's so many topics involved in there that you have to deal with. And there is some literature that's written prior to the Gospels for which we can establish with a really high degree of historical certainty, and those are the letters of Paul. And what's interesting is, let me see if I can give you a short argument here.
Galatians 2:2 is one of the most incredible verses in the New Testament. I love the way the King James translates it here, but most translations say just about the same thing. Paul says in Galatians 2:2, I went back up after 14 years to see the other apostles and to set before them the gospel I was preaching, to see if I was running or had run in vain. What? Yeah, I went back up to Jerusalem to make sure we were all on the same page, to make sure we were all presenting the same gospel. Neat. So we do want to make sure that you guys were preaching the same thing. Galatians 2:2, I went back up there, I shared with them the gospel I was preaching, and then just a few verses later, Galatians 2:6, these 5 words in English, they added nothing to me. They added nothing to me. Then just 3 verses later, this is where we get the phrase, they laid hands on Barnabas and me, and they gave us the right hand of fellowship, and they said, y'all go to the Gentiles and take this message. We're going to stay here and give the message to the Jews. But the point is, the message was the same. They added nothing to me. You take it to them, we'll give it here, and that's what we decide to do. Paul says it this way in 1 Corinthians 15:11, reflecting on this is them telling Paul that he was okay. Here's Paul telling them that they're okay. 1 Corinthians 15:11, he just gives a list of the appearances, and then he says this, whether it is I or they, who are they? They are the other apostles, he says so in the context. Whether it is I or they, this is what we preach and this is what you believe. Paul's saying, hey, you don't like me? Great. Go talk to Peter. Don't like Peter? Go talk to James. Because you're going to get the same message no matter who you talk to. Whether it's I or they, so we teach, and so you believe. Next few verses, that's why Paul says 3 times, if we're wrong about this, we're liars. If we're wrong about this, we're preaching in vain. The we're is he and the other apostles. Why? Because they were preaching the same message. It's uniform.
He says, they added nothing to what I had to say. They gave me the right hand of fellowship. So in other words, they said, you're good, Paul. Keep up the good work, brother. And there are extra biblical sources. I just can't get into them. It's just too much. But they corroborate that Paul was teaching on the gospel essentials what the Jerusalem apostles were. People like Clement of Rome and Polycarp, who very likely were discipled by Peter and John respectively, and they say that Paul was accurately and reliably teaching the message of truth. Okay, so and they knew Peter and John, and so they're saying this after Paul's dead. So they knew Paul couldn't come back at them. And there's so much more that we could talk about to say, corroborate that Paul was telling the truth here. He was teaching what they were teaching. They endorsed his teachings to be in alignment with their own. Now, what were they teaching? In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul gives some oral tradition that most likely goes back to the Jerusalem apostles, was almost certainly what they were preaching. And he even calls it the gospel message. Remember the thing he had ran past them, the Jerusalem apostles, and they endorsed. He says, I want to remind you, Corinthians, of the gospel message that I had preached, and in which you got saved, and in which you continue in your Christian faith. And he talks about the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, and the appearances to many others, in individual and in group settings, friend and foe alike. So pretty cool stuff. Very early things that we can, data that we can go back to the eyewitnesses themselves. Now, we can do some of that with the Gospels, but not to the same degree of strength and certainty that we can with Paul's letters. Chapter 4. What can we know from this literature? And here we can come up with 3 virtually undisputed facts. Jesus' death by crucifixion, that shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences in which they believed the risen Jesus had appeared to them. And this experience transformed their lives to the point where they were willing to suffer continuously and willing to die for their belief, their gospel proclamation and belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them. And third, there was a once skeptic named Paul who had an experience in which he believed was the risen Jesus appeared to him, and that radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. And we often just kind of brush past this. Skeptics do all the time. Well, yeah, but Paul, he wasn't a religious skeptic. Like that really makes a difference. It's like religious skeptics aren't biased. I mean, think about this. You know, Osama bin Laden was recently killed. But let's say that before he was killed, all of a sudden, you're watching television at night, and it says, we interrupt this program to bring you a special live report from our reporter embedded secretly somewhere within Pakistan, where he has found Osama bin Laden. And this pickup truck pulls up, and there's shots fires and all yelling going on in the air. And this guy emerges from the truck, and it's Osama bin Laden. He puts his hand up, and he says, my brothers, I want you to know that I was in a cave yesterday, and while I was praying at the call of prayer, all of a sudden this light flashed through the cave, and this voice bellowed throughout the walls of the cave, and it said, Osama, Osama, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And I'm Jesus of Nazareth. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to go out and preach the gospel, my death, burial, resurrection, and that I'm the Messiah, the divine Son of God. And then he continues and he says, I'm here to do just that. I saw Jesus. He appeared to me. And we have been involved in a false religion. I want to encourage all of you to do what I've done, to leave Islam, realize that Muhammad is a false prophet, and become followers of Jesus. And at that point, they pelt him with stones. That's a little bit different than just Joe America converting to Christianity now, isn't it? That's different from the disciples of Jesus going out and proclaiming that he'd been raised from the dead. We've got a sworn enemy of the church who is now doing, and that has to be explained by the historian. How are you going to explain it? And how are you going to explain that in light of all the facts that we know about the relevant historical bedrock? And that brings us to our final chapter, chapter 5. Now let's just kind of pull this together. Now I'm going to just compare 2 hypotheses pretty quickly. I'd compare all of the most frequent or popular ones used in academia today in the book. But let me just take the resurrection and then the one most popular by skeptics today, and that is the hallucination hypothesis. Now when we look at the resurrection hypothesis, We take these three facts, Jesus' death by crucifixion, that shortly thereafter his disciples had an experiences in which they believed it was the risen Jesus appearing to them. And third, the appearance to Paul, that Paul, a skeptic, had an experience that he believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. He was so convinced it was, he converted to Christianity, and he later died as a Christian martyr. These all three are undisputed. Skeptics, whether atheist, agnostic, Jewish, whatever, they acknowledge these three facts. So what do we do with them? Will the resurrection hypothesis account for these? You bet. Accounts for all three of them, accounts for them without forcing them to fit. There's no ambiguity involved. There's no kind of speculation involved in that. So it passes those three. What about plausibility? We know it's implausible that people come back from the dead by natural causes, but no one's saying Jesus was raised by natural causes. If he was raised, it was by supernatural causes. We can't know whether God would have wanted to raise Jesus. So the plausibility criterion is something I'm still trying to put my arms around. But for now, I think we can't say that it's implausible, and I'm not so certain we could say it's plausible, because we can't know ahead of time whether God would want to raise Jesus. So I think it's inscrutable. It's just indeterminate. So it passes three, and the fourth really doesn't apply to it. It's almost like asking the question, what's the prior probability of the universe existing? Huh? What do you mean the prior probability? We know the posterior probability, it's 100%. It's here. Well, what's the prior probability of the universe existing? Well, you can't answer that. It's unanswerable. And I think with the plausibility criterion, because it's a miracle here involving God, we just can't answer it. It's just unanswerable from the viewpoint of a historian. That's not negative. It's not positive or negative. It's just there. It's unanswerable. So it passes three of the four, doesn't fail the fourth. What about hallucination hypothesis? Hallucination hypothesis would be the disciples were all grief-stricken as a result of Jesus' death by crucifixion. And so what happens? What happens when a loved one or a close associate dies? You're really close, a best friend. You go out and you drink, right? Certainly they had spiked grape juice in that day. Paul says, don't get drunk with wine. So you could get drunk with wine, of course. If they had hallucinogenic drugs. Maybe there was another reason they called Jesus the Most High God. I don't know. Maybe you got these different things going on. Maybe they were grief-stricken. They go out. They're drinking or whatever. They see a shadow. They hear a voice that sounds like Jesus. Oh, he's been raised from the dead. In fact, did you know that you're most likely to experience a hallucination if you're a senior adult bereaving the loss of a loved one? Probability that you will experience a hallucination is 50%, according to multiple studies. Hallucination in some sense. And the most recent comprehensive study on hallucinations say that there's at least 6 modes in which we experience a hallucination. Visual, which you see something. A hallucination, by the way, is a false perception. It is something, you perceive something that isn't really there. So a visual hallucination, you see something that isn't there. Auditory, you hear something that's not there. Olfactory, smell. Gustatory, taste. Tactile, you feel like, how many of you have smartphones? You had it when you first got the smartphone. You set it to vibrate when a text or an email came in. You did that? Now, how many of you experienced a false alarm? You're a lot of laughs. All right, you pulled it out, you looked at it. Oh, I didn't get a text. I didn't get an email. You thought you did. You experienced a tactile hallucination. You see, you don't have to be a fruit or a flake to experience one. It's just normal. Mental health and can be fine, and you experience a hallucination. Or how about a kinesthetic hallucination, the sense that you're falling or movement? You ever wake up in the morning because you felt like you were falling off a building or something? That is a kinesthetic hallucination. Hallucinations are typically experienced in a single mode. Unless you're schizophrenic or on drugs, you typically experience them in a single mode, not multiple. So in other words, you might see something, but you don't see and hear it. When you had that tactile hallucination from your mobile phone, you felt it, but you didn't hear the buzz. You only felt it, okay? So it's a single mode hallucination. Now, when it comes to the highest percentage of those who experience hallucinations, senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one, 39% experienced a hallucination where they sensed the person's presence in the room. So it didn't fall into any of those 6 categories. They didn't hear them, they didn't see them, smell the cologne or whatever the perfume that they used to wear. They just sensed that they were in the room. 39% of the 50%, or roughly 20% of all senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. Only 7% of all senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one had a visual hallucination of that person. And that's the highest percentage group experiencing hallucinations. Now, when it comes to the disciples, the earliest reports of the resurrection appearances we have, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, say that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. So we're not talking about 7%. We're talking about an unthinkable, unprecedented 100%. Oh, by the way, visual, all visual, 100%. And did I fail to mention simultaneously? And their hallucinations would have been of the content that would have been so similar that they all thought they were seeing the same thing. That's really implausible. There's nothing like that in the literature to show that those things happen. So it fails the plausibility criterion. It doesn't account for the appearance of Paul. Paul's not grieving, right? Jesus is the last person in the world he wants to see. And so it doesn't account for all the facts. You have to force them to fit if you want to make them fit. You have to invent things like, well, maybe Paul was feeling guilty for killing those nice Christians. And he, all of a sudden, well, that made him want to see Jesus, right? So you have to come up with these speculations. So it's ad hoc. It lacks explanatory power because you got to force things to fit by maybe saying, yeah, it's unlikely they experience these group appearances, but this is just one of, sometimes you get a royal flush when you play poker, right? So here you got 3 royal flushes, He appeared to the 12, to all the apostles, and to more than 500 at one time. 3 of them, not 1, 2, but 3 highly improbable group appearances in the earliest report about the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. You have to force it to fit. So it lacks scope, it lacks power, it's implausible, and it's ad hoc. Guess what? The hallucination hypothesis fails all 4 of the criteria for the best explanation, whereas the resurrection hypothesis passes 3 of the 4 with flying colors and doesn't fail the 4th. Historically speaking, which one is the best hypothesis? Lay faith aside for a moment and just look at this scientifically through the eyes of a historian. We're following strictly controlled historical method using only facts granted by virtually all, even skeptical biblical scholars, things that we can establish with a very high degree of historical certainty. Haven't even used the Gospels in it. Just taking the best, the most certain of the literature, taking these knowable historical facts, subjecting the strictly controlled historical method. Which one's the best hypothesis? Resurrection or hallucinations? It's no contest. And this is just so cool because this establishes that what we as believers have taken by faith has been strongly established by historical practice.
I've read all the great writers. I've read all the writers that think they're great. And I concluded not one of them, not one scholar, has ever given me an honest intellectual argument to refute the resurrection. But what captured my thinking intellectually in the process of these other areas was all the prophecies from the Old Testament fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Folks, you have to understand, I didn't want to believe. I was satisfied in my life. I had my whole life mapped out, and Jesus was not a part of it. In fact, I thought he would destroy it. He did. He gave me a better one. But in the scriptures, there's 333 prophecies in the Old Testament about who the coming Messiah will be. I actually say there's 70 major prophecies and 270 ramifications. In other words, there's 70 basic prophecies. And then God through the ages would add to them, add another detail, which was a prophecy in itself, but it would add it around the same initial prophecy. So there's 333 prophecies, all fulfilled in one person. The Old Testament, written over a period of about 1,000 years, was completed over 500 years before Christ. In university, I'd always wait for this because somebody would pop up, the professor or something, say, wait a minute, Josh, I don't think that's true. I don't think these prophecies were written down till the time of Christ. And they were written down so they would coincide with his life so it looked like he was fulfilling them. That sounds pretty good, unless you want to think. And most people would rather die than think. You say, it's not a 500-year gap. Well, look, the Septuagint, don't let that big word throw you. The Septuagint is the name given to the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. When they took the Old Testament, put it into Greek, they call it the Septuagint. You know when that was initiated? It has all the prophecies in it, everything, 250 years before Christ. Now, folks, if you got a problem with 500 years, You get a bigger problem in 250 years because, boy, it is documented historically. The Septuagint was started its translation 250 years before Christ was ever born. So history absolutely proves there's at least a 250-year gap from these prophecies being written down and their fulfillment in Christ. I want to look at those prophecies because it's an area that I really struggle with. It's probably one of the two biggest areas that took me over the edge in the university to place my trust in Christ as Savior and Lord against my total desire in my life and my will. And I had to really be convinced of it to go against all of that. I look at it as an address. God writing an address to identify his son from everyone who has ever lived. I believe, now I'm not dogmatic on this because I haven't done enough research on it, but I think there are 40 major people who claim to be the Messiah historically. And as far as I know, not one of them ever appealed to prophecy to substantiate their claims. They couldn't. They couldn't appeal to the detail, and you'll see why in a little bit. Your address, now think of it. Your own personal address, even if it's a P.O. box or general delivery, separates you from 6.8 billion people on the face of the earth. Now think of that. Your address, no matter where in the world they send you a letter, it'll get to you usually. It'll get to you instead of somebody else of the 6.7 billion people. Do you ever think how unique your address is? Well, God wrote an address that would identify his son from everyone who ever lived. Now, keeping in mind, in the fullness of time, when every exact detail had been fulfilled, God sent forth his son. Let's look at that address. Now, I can't do this the normal way I do because the way the PowerPoint is set up with the mechanism here, they can't do it progressively. And so you're going to lose some of the impact because we can't do the progressiveness as I speak, where normally you see it on the screen, boom, 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 boom. And I'm going to speak faster than most people you've ever heard speak in some of this. I'll match many auctioneers because I don't want you to get so much the content. I want you to get the impact of the content. You can go to josh.org/resource and download all the content, all the documentation, everything. Now, let's see God writing this address. It all starts out before recorded time, and it says in Genesis 3:15, he'd be born of the seed of the woman. You say, well, Josh, that's nice. Well, look. Every single person in the scripture, other people, was always the seed of the man. The only one in scripture to be born of the seed of the woman was a Messiah. Why? The virgin birth. The only one. So first, seed of the woman. Then we go down to recorded time. Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Do you realize that all nations of the world can be traced back to one of these 3 individuals? A lot of people don't realize that. Now God eliminates 2/3 of the nations of the world when he says that my son will be of the seed of the woman, the lineage of Shem. And then the lineage of Shem, there were many lines of descendants. And now God eliminates all of them but one. When he says that my son will not only be of the seed of the woman, the lineage of Shem, but the descendants of Abraham, who we called out of the Ur of the Chaldees. Now Abraham had 8 children, 2 by Sarah. Now God eliminates 7/8 of the sons of Abraham. Now think of this. I brushed my teeth this morning. I've been having trouble with them ever since. I have a stutter. It only comes out when I speak. But statistically, think of the implications of this. He now eliminates 7/8 of the descendants of Abraham when he says that my son will not only be the seed of the woman, the descendants of Abraham, but the line of Isaac. Now Isaac had 2 children, Jacob and Esau. Now God eliminates 50% of the line of Abraham and Isaac when he says that my son will be of the seed of the woman, the descendants of Abraham, and the line of Isaac. Now Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, and I'm getting a little behind myself here. And now God eliminates 50% of them when he says that my son will be of the seed of the woman, the descendants of Abraham, the line of Isaac, and the line of Jacob. Now Jacob had 12 sons, out of which came the 12 tribes of Israel. Now think of this statistically. Now God eliminates 11/12 of the tribes of Israel when he says that my son will not only be of the seed of the woman, the seed of the woman, the lineage and descendants of Abraham, the line of Jacob, and the tribe of Judah. Now, within the tribe of Judah, there were many family lines. Now God eliminates all the family lines but one. When he says that my son will be of the seed of the woman, the lineage and descendants of Abraham, line of Isaac, line of Jacob, tribe of Judah, and the family of Jesse. Now, Jesse had 8 children. Now, think of this statistically. Now God eliminates 7/8 of the family line of Jesse. When he says that my son will be the seed of the woman, the lineage and descendants of Abraham, line of Isaac, line of Jacob, tribe of Judah, and the family of Jesse, in the house of David. And then we go down to about 1012 BC in Psalm 22, with a very unusual prophecy, where now God says, my son will not only be of the seed of the woman, the lineage and descendants of Abraham, line of Isaac, line of Jacob, tribe of Judah, family of Jesse, house of David, but he will be crucified. His hands and his feet will be pierced against a tree. That's 1012 BC. Come on, Josh, a lot of people were crucified. Yes, but folks, you got to understand, that method of crucifixion was not put into effect until 800 years later by the Romans. And then God narrows it down further. And one day there were 29 prophecies fulfilled. It's all this is documented in the big book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And now, God, these are 7 prophecies in one day he fulfilled. In Psalm 41 and Zechariah 11, when now God says that my son will be the seed of the woman, the lineage of Shem, the descendants of Abraham, the line of Isaac, the line of Jacob, tribe of Judah, family of Jesse, house of David, be crucified, but he'd be betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces, not $29.99, 30 pieces of silver, not gold. Now think of this, another 50%, not gold, silver. It'd be thrown on the floor, not placed at a table. It'd be in the temple, not in the market, and it would be used to buy a potter's field. And then God narrows it down further. Of all the cities of the world, in Micah 5:2 eliminates them all but one, a small city of less than 1,000 people for the entrance of the Messiah into humanity. When he says that my son will not only be the seed of the woman, lineage of Shem, descendants of Abraham, line of Isaac, line of Jacob, tribe of Judah, family of Jesse, house of David, be crucified, betrayed by a friend, 30 pieces of silver thrown on the floor in the temple used to buy a potter's field, but he'd be born in that little tiny city of Bethlehem Ephrathah. And a professor once said, come on, Josh, if God was that smart, he could tell when it was going to happen. I said, he did. You say, what? Yeah. In Malachi 3. You might call it Malachi, but in Malachi 3. God narrows it down further when he gives the timeline. He says, my son will be born of the seed of the woman, the lineage of Shem, descendants of Abraham, line of Isaac, line of Jacob, tribe of Judah, family of Jesse, house of David, be crucified, betrayed by a friend, 30 pieces of silver thrown on the floor in the temple used to buy a potter's field, born in the city of Bethlehem Ephrathah, and it'll all take place before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. When was that? 70 AD. Whoa. You ought to see it when I do all 333. It takes me an hour and 12 minutes to go through all of them, one after another. 333 prophecies, all fulfilled in one person. Professor said to me, Josh, it's all a coincidence. Well, let's see that. Take just 8 of these prophecies, just 8. Of the 333 prophecies, just 8. And this is all documented. You take 8 of these prophecies, the probability they could be fulfilled in just one person would be 1 in every 1 times 10 to the 17th power. That's 10 with 17 zeros. That's almost equal to the national debt. It's 10 with, it's more in fact. It'll get there soon, though. But it's 10 with 17 zero after it. Where is that slide? Yeah, probability.
When it comes to the prophecies of Jesus, one of the most remarkable things is what takes place when you take those prophecies of Jesus and you work them out mathematically. Now, there has been a mathematician who's done that. Peter Stoner, famous mathematician, went in, looked at how many prophecies there were, 300 prophecies. And then as he broke down those prophecies, he said, let me just take 8 of them and figure out what's the likelihood of 8 of these prophecies being fulfilled in one person's life.
So Professor Stoner gives us an illustration. It helps us to understand the nature of probability. So let's just say that 1 in every 10 men that you meet has a bald head. And 1 in every 100 men that you meet happen to have a missing finger. You want to find out how many men are there that I'm going to bump into that actually have a missing finger and a bald head. So what you do is you multiply the first two figures, and then you have your answer. 1 in every 1,000 men that you meet are going to actually have a missing finger and a bald head.
Peter Stoner presented his class with a challenge. The class was to look at the Bible and try to find all the prophecies regarding the coming of Christ to see what was the probability that one man could come out of all the men that existed in the history of the world and yet fulfill exactly every single prophecy.
One of the prophecies that Peter W. Stoner mentions is Zechariah 9:9, which reads, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The question is how many people in Earth's history have been kings? And of those individuals, how many have ridden on a donkey into Jerusalem?
Well, I don't know. Neither did the class. So they decided to assign an absurdly high number. They decided 1 out of every 100 men who ever lived rode into Jerusalem as a king on a donkey, of all things. I mean, 1 in 100. This is obviously absurdly high. But that's the point. Stoner effectively buffered his calculations and thus his conclusions against objections that he had biased his calculations to favor Jesus' identification as the Messiah.
Another prophecy that Professor Stoner looked at was Micah chapter 5 and verse 2.
In Micah 5 verse 2, there's an incredible prophecy that is given hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, pinpointing exactly the place where Jesus would be born. It states, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel."
What's amazing is the fact that there are 2 Bethlehems, 2 cities called Bethlehem in Israel, one in the northern portion of the kingdom, one in the south.
This specifies which Bethlehem. This specifies Bethlehem Ephratah, which is Bethlehem in Judah. So the prophecy is very precise. But in addition to that, when you think about Mary and Joseph, Mary finds out that she's pregnant. She's in Nazareth. And yet suddenly this decree comes out. This census is being proclaimed by the Romans. And they're told that they have to go back to the birthplace of the husband. And so Joseph makes his way to Bethlehem in Ephratah.
They have to take their family back to Bethlehem. Joseph has to be taxed according to Roman law. Jesus is born in Bethlehem.
The prophecy fulfilled right to the very, very place where Micah, hundreds of years earlier, predicted it to happen was just remarkable when you think about all the circumstances involved.
So Stoner and his students, they decided that they wanted to figure out, in the light of the world's population, how many people have actually been born in the city of Bethlehem. 1 out of every 280,000 people was a very conservative estimate that they made, that they found mathematically, of how many people have actually been born in Bethlehem.
Now, another prophecy they looked at is found in the 53rd chapter of the book of Isaiah. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth.
Stoner brings this out, that Jesus was a just man, condemned to die, and he said not a word, not one word in his defense.
Now, how many have done that? Well, his class didn't know. Of course not. How could you know? So here again, they assigned a conservatively high number. For the purposes of their calculations, they said, okay, how about 1 in every 1,000 men who ever lived were both wrongly accused of a crime and during their trial chose to speak no word in their defense.
And then as he broke down those prophecies, he said, let me just take 8 of them and figure out what's the likelihood of 8 of these prophecies being fulfilled in one person's life. So just with those 8 prophecies, he said the probability of one person fulfilling all 8 was 1 in 10 to the power of 17. That's like taking silver dollars all over Texas.
They covered the entire state. And on one of those coins somewhere in the state, you have a particular coin marked with a black X.
And you put it randomly, stir it up somehow, and randomly put it somewhere in the state of Texas, covered 2 feet deep with these silver dollars, and you send a blind man in. The probability that he will just wander the state of Texas, reach down on his first try, and come up with this marked silver dollar is the probability that one man could fulfill all 8 of these prophecies about Jesus.
Now, not only that, but he went further and he said, all right, let me see if I take 48 of these.
48 out of the 300. Okay, what's the probability that one man in the history of the world could fulfill just 48 of these prophecies? And the number was a staggering 1 man out of 1 with 157 zeros after it. That number is so big, just to give you an idea, scientists have determined that there are only 1 with 80 zeros after it, atoms, in the entire universe. That's not just our planet or our solar system or our galaxy, but the entire universe only has 1 with 80 zeros after it.
There's not even enough atoms in the universe in order to hold that number. Now, this answers the question about some people say, well, maybe a lot of people have met these prophecies. Maybe it's not just, Jesus, that you could have a whole bunch of people who meet all of these prophecies. But that's just not possible.
It's so mind-boggling. It's so impossible. And that's not even close to the probability of what it would be to fulfill 48, which is 1 with 157 zeros after it. Staggering. Staggering. That's only 48 prophecies. There are 300.
What you've got in here is you've got something so remarkable that the whole universe can hold it. In fact, this is what Peter Stoner said. He said, any man who rejects Christ as the Son of God is rejecting a fact proved perhaps more absolutely than any other fact in the world.